Well, actually, let's get underway here. Time is precious, but welcome everyone to a Massachusetts Peace Action webinar sponsored by our Middle East Working Group, A Better Way in the Middle East with Trita Parsi. We're going to be talking about an incredibly important subject tonight as the United States pivots out of the Middle East. Diplomatic efforts in the region are increasing, which is a good thing. It's good. Talk is always better than more war, as someone once said. But tonight we're going to be talking about the Baghdad Dialogue, as it's known. And this is a conversation that's been happening between Middle Eastern nations that have not had solid diplomatic relations for too long. So in particular, we're going to be discussing an article written by our guest, Trita Parsi. For those of you who don't know, Trita Parsi is an award-winning author. He's an expert on U.S.-Iranian relations, Iranian foreign politics, the geopolitics of the Middle East. He's also the co-founder and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. As I was telling Trita before we began, we owe, all of us as peace activists, owe Trita our thanks, because the Quincy Institute is a Washington think tank that is for peace, and it has been such a resource for me personally in my work, and I'm sure many of the people on the call too know the Quincy Institute and its wonderful work. We will be providing links for ways to find the Quincy Institute and everything they do. But let's get underway. Trita, welcome to the program. Thank you so much for joining us again. And can you tell us just a little bit about your article? Because these dialogues have not been covered in the mainstream press here in the United States nearly as much as they deserve.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Brian, and thank you to all of you for joining tonight, and thank you to Massachusetts Peace Action. You guys are doing an amazing job, and it's so good to be able to team up with you all and hear that our work has been helpful to you. Certainly your work has been tremendously helpful to us, and these are important times. We talked earlier on about the War Powers Resolution on Capitol Hill. There's a lot going on that deserves not only our attention, but all the mobilization and grassroots power that groups such as Massachusetts Peace Action and others can bring to it. I also want to hope everyone is doing well and that you're not lacking anything in these snowy days. Thankfully, we in Washington escape the snow. It usually does not happen. When you guys get hit, we get something, and so far we have gotten nothing from that at least. So I'm very pleased by that, but I hope you guys are all doing well. Wanted to talk to you a little bit about what's happening with the Middle East and the options and the pathways that are currently in front of us. I would argue that right now, as a result of the fact that the United States has managed to convince, whether it wanted to or not, a very large number of states in the region that the US is simply either leaving, or even if it stays, it does not really matter that much because the United States no longer has the will to fight in or for the region. And I think this is an important distinction to understand. Even if the United States keeps a very large number, if not all of its bases in the Middle East, right now we're in a situation in which most countries have concluded, nevertheless, that the political will to engage in direct combat in the Middle East no longer exists. It is politically very unpopular in the United States, to the point in which politicians are wary of it in a way that they have not been in the last 20 years. As a result, most of the states are acting as if the United States already has left. And in that, we now have a development in which, contrary to what a lot of people in Washington, D.C. predicted, they all thought that if the U.S. leaves or if the U.S. is not there fighting every war, chaos would ensue. Whatever order exists in the Middle East would collapse. On the contrary, we have seen what people in the Quincy Institute and other places have predicted, which is if the United States pulls back militarily, it actually will create a situation in which the cost of continuing a reckless and aggressive and warlike foreign policy for many of the states in the region significantly goes up because they can no longer count on the US backing them up or bailing them out. And as a result, their incentive structure will change and they will be more inclined to pursue diplomacy with their neighbors because that is the more optimal policy in a situation in which the US is not there to bail them out. And that's exactly what we've seen. We have seen that there's been significant dialogue taking place between the Iranians and the Saudis, the Emiratis and the Iranians, the Turks and the Egyptians. It's actually quite fascinating the extent to which regional diplomacy has blossomed precisely because of this one factor, the US pulling out. Now, I'm not claiming that that diplomacy has necessarily led to a large number of agreements or that the fundamental situation in the region has changed as a result. But it means, though, that the regional states are actually trying to figure this out on their own, which ultimately is a very, very good thing. But in that, this is not the only potential model for a future Middle East. There's also a competitor to it. And that competitor is the Abraham Accord, which of course in the United States has received a tremendous amount of positive coverage because on the surface, it looks kind of good. You know, countries are apparently stopping to be at war with each other and they're signing peace agreements and trade agreements, etc. That's how it has been presented, and it's difficult to, on the surface, object to that. You only have to scratch the surface a little bit, however, to see a rather different picture. First of all, as I'm sure many people here know, that from the perspective of a more long-lasting peace, this is actually quite a detrimental development. Because in the past, full recognition of Israel, as well as vice versa, was on the table all the time, but it was supposed to come as a result of a significant give and take and an end of the occupation. Instead, now, the Trump administration pushed for a complete recognition of Israel, in which Israel gave essentially nothing to the Palestinians. The Palestinians are completely sidelined, and instead, peace, so quote unquote, has been created between a bunch of countries that actually were never at war with each other. The UAE and Israel has never been at war with each other, nor have Morocco, Sudan, or Bahrain. Not to say that they were necessarily always friendly with each other, but reality is actually on an intelligence basis, the Moroccans, the Emiratis have collaborated with the Israelis for a very long period of time. But I'm going to set aside the plight of the Palestinians in this analysis. It's not to belittle it in any way, shape, or form, but to point to another aspect that is, I think, even more difficult to be able to see because of all of this surfacial praise and rather superficial analysis about the Abraham Accord. And that is that at the end of the day, the Abraham Accord, if you read the paper that Kushner published, his institute published, it's very clear. It requires a significant amount of continued American military and economic involvement and commitment to the Middle East. It is explicit on the fact that the Abraham Accord cannot survive without the critical support that the United States has provided it. And that critical support cannot be understated. At the end of the day, the commitments and the concessions that were given did not come from Israel, they came from the United States. It was the United States that changed its position on Western Sahara in order to get the Moroccans to recognize Israel. It was the United States that took Sudan off of the terrorist list in order to get them to recognize Israel. It was the United States that offered the Emiratis F-35s in order for them to recognize Israel. So there's no concessions from the Israeli side. The concessions are actually coming from the American side. And that's just one of the examples of the contributions of the commitment the United States need to continue to have. But more importantly, when you look at it, you see that this is actually not a new policy. This is a continuation of a 2 to 3 decade old American approach to the Middle East, which is centered on the idea that the Middle East is going to be stable if we isolate and contain Iran. Iran has been the big boogeyman of the Middle East for the last 3 decades. That is not to say that the Iranians have not done a tremendous amount of very negative things. They certainly have, but the degree to which the threat of Iran has been exaggerated in order to be able to justify a lot of Middle Eastern policies of the United States is I think, quite undisputable. Now, however, this new old policy is getting a new face, because instead of very explicitly talking about containing Iran, instead we're talking about a peace agreement between the Israelis and the Emiratis and others. And this is a direction that the United States is frankly quite likely to go in. We're going to continue to invest in the Abrams Accord. When Tony Blinken was in Indonesia, this was high on his agenda. He wanted Indonesia to recognize Israel, and the Indonesians were actually quite offended by the proposition, precisely because of the fact that the Israelis were not giving anything in order for that recognition to come, and that from the American side, there's not a single argument that can be articulated to explain why this actually would bring us closer to a real peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians. But this is the direction that the Biden administration is going in. And the danger in it is that we will actually go back into the old pattern of the past, in which, in order for this arrangement to survive, it cannot stand on its own legs, because it requires constant support, military and economic support from the Middle East, including continues to sell all kinds of weapons to Arab dictators in the region, which then further entangles the United States in the Middle East and makes it more difficult for the United States to be able to withdraw its troops. At the same time, more difficult for the region to actually find its own equilibrium and its own peace. The alternative to the Abrams Accord is what we're seeing done by the Iraqi government, at least up until the last elections, which was called the Baghdad Dialogue. The Iraqis had taken up the opportunity that, in the absence of this American military presence, push for diplomacy between various states. They were the ones that were hosting the dialogue between the Iranians and the Saudis, as well as, to a certain extent, what the Emiratis were doing. And all of this climaxed in the Baghdad summit last fall, in which, for the first time in a very, very long time, you had the Saudi, Emirati, Iraqi, Turkish, Iranian prime minister or foreign ministers all on the same stage. And they were beginning an indigenously driven dialogue in order to be able to resolve their conflicts. Now, the reason why I think this Baghdad Dialogue is superior to the Abrams Accord, both for the region as a whole, but also from a US national interest perspective, is A, the Baghdad Dialogue is indigenously driven. It is not imposed on the region from the outside, but it's coming from the states themselves. And as a result, has far greater legitimacy and far greater longevity than anything that could be pushed onto the region from the outside. The Abrams Accord is pushed from the outside by the Trump administration onto the Middle East. All the concessions, again, were actually from the American side for these states to agree to it. Secondly, the Abrams Accord is organized against another state. The organizing principle, again, being that these countries will make peace because they have a shared threat, and that is Iran. And now together they're going to be containing and opposing that state. The Baghdad Dialogue is not organized against anyone. It's not trying to cement conflicts and essentially try to deter states and do arms builds up in order to make sure that the other state cannot attack, but is actually trying to resolve the conflicts through dialogue. Whereas what the Abrams Accord does, it actually cements the existing fractures, and that cementation is what is called peace, whereas in reality, it is very, very far from peace. Thirdly, this Baghdad Dialogue did not require and did not include American involvement. I'm not against American involvement, but for the region to be able to find its own ways of resolving conflicts without having the US involved is actually a very, very good thing. Now, if the United States can play a helpful role and be part of the dialogue and help facilitate diplomacy, I think that would be a fantastic thing. I just don't think that right now that is a possibility for a very simple reason. The policies of the past, which again, the Abrams Accord would be a continuation of, have created a scenario in which the United States is actually a party to most of the conflicts in the region. As a result, it has disqualified itself from being able to play the role of a mediator. So we are involved in Yemen. We are involved in so many of these different conflicts. We are a target of Iraqi militias, etc. And this has created a scenario in which no one is thinking about bringing the United States into the diplomacy. In fact, the countries that are playing a diplomatic role right now are countries such as China and Russia, precisely because they have not pursued the same path as we did. I'm not endorsing their foreign policy or their domestic policies, but they have actually rather cleverly and carefully made sure that they're not taking sides. And as a result, as an outside partner, they can play a mediation role or facilitation role in the way that the United States cannot. So for these reasons, I think the Baghdad approach is actually far superior, not just for the region. Whatever solutions they can come up with will actually have far greater longevity and legitimacy because it's coming from the region itself. It's also not costing the United States anything because surely we can help if we're asked to, but it's actually happening completely without us and without any involvement of us. Whereas almost every other initiative that you can point to for the last 30 years is something that the United States or an outside party outside of the US have been pushing on to the region. It requires a degree of political maturity to get to this point. And the question is, are we going to be nurturing this? Are we going to be supporting and helping that process to go forward, even though we may not directly be involved in it? Or are we going to instead invest in the Abrams Accord, which actually cements conflict rather than actually resolving those conflicts and requires more American involvement, including military sales to these different countries? Those are the options, but those are not the options that I think right now are visible to most observers because it's all shrouded in this language of a peace agreement. And as a result, makes it very difficult for people to actually analyze it more carefully and show what it actually is, which is this is a glorified arms sales that is continuing an old policy of the United States, but with a different name. That might be a harsh assessment, but I do think it's accurate. And I'll stop here. Happy to take your questions, not only on this issue, but also if you want to talk about the JCPOA, I'll be happy to talk about that too. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you so much. And I just want to let our audience know that you are going to have a chance to ask Trita your questions. You can do so in one of two ways. You can either put your question in the chat and we can read it off for you, or you can use the raise hand feature at the bottom and we will call on you in turn, bring you up on the screen, and you can talk to Trita yourself. I just would ask that you keep your questions brief and make sure that they're actually questions for Trita. But I think I'll take the first bite at the apple. I'm wondering if you can assess the first year of the Biden administration in terms of foreign policy in the Middle East, and especially in the last 6 months, their reaction to the Baghdad Dialogue that took place, because I think you rightly noted the credibility gap that the United States has in the region, and your description of the Abraham Accords of using American weaponry and American military technology to try and curry favor and to try and boost peace accords in the region has been tried and has really been found wanting. So what do you think about the Biden administration and their efforts?
So my sense of where the Biden administration is on all of these issues is I think, frankly, it started off quite well. I mean, you all remember it was roughly a year ago in which the Biden administration announced that we have to end the war in Yemen, and we're going to stop arms sales, at least offensive weapons, to Yemen. It was clear that, you know, the caveat of offensive weapons was a bit of a massive Swiss cheese hole there, and it turns out to be much bigger than most people expected. But nevertheless, it started off well. Moreover, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, I do understand the logistics of it, and the implementation ended up being very messy, but it was an important decision, and I think the right decision to pull out and end that endless war. Unfortunately, what we have seen there, just as a parenthesis, is that all of the concern that existed amongst the people who were opposed to, and I'm not talking about everyone, but from when you take a look at a lot of the people who were opposed to the withdrawal, and they were invoking, human rights arguments and girls' schools, etc. I'm quite stunned to see how silent they are right now when the Biden administration has chosen to continue sanctions on Afghanistan and freeze all of the Afghan government's money, which unfortunately now belongs to the Taliban, but nevertheless. And as a result, we're seeing mass starvation happening in Afghanistan right now. All of that concern that existed in the media and elsewhere for the plight of the Afghan people seem to have just completely evaporated. I think it frankly reflects the pattern that we've seen before, that these type of concerns are oftentimes invoked in order to continue or to start a war, but when it comes to ending a war, suddenly they seem to not be valid any longer. But even with that decision, Biden made a statement saying that this marks an end of an era of regime change wars. And the language he used, more or less, really gave many people the impression that we were about to see some larger shifts. And I do know that earlier, up until mid-summer of last year, there were clear considerations of a larger reduction of military troops from the Middle East. At one point, several of the bases, at the time 19 bases, would have actually been closed. This was seriously considered. What seems to have happened since then is that the Biden administration concluded that this great power competition that they are seeing vis-a-vis China actually would not take place in the South China Sea, would largely not be about just Taiwan, but the competition actually would be taking place in Africa, in the Middle East, in Europe. And as a result, the China argument, instead of being an argument as to why you need to get out of the Middle East, ended up becoming an argument as to why you need to stay in the Middle East, because that's where a big chunk of the competition will take place. So again, even though it's not because the United States has any plans of using those bases for military campaigns or directly be involved, it's about making sure that those are not vacated, because if they are, the fear is that the Chinese would move in, which I think is quite different from what the Chinese plans are. But I think that is a shift that has happened in the Biden administration for the last 6 or so months. And in that vein, we also have seen another thing that is very much related to China. If you take a look at what Brett McGurk has been saying, who is the Middle East director at the NSC, he talks about that the doctrine of the Biden administration essentially is that we're really going to go back to the basics of US foreign policy in the Middle East. And by that, he's trying to create a division between what supposedly is the basic Middle East policy and these other bad things, the excesses such as the invasion of Iraq, this ambition to transform the region. On the face of it, who could be against putting an end to regime change wars? I think that would be great. But in my analysis, those regime change wars are actually an extension of the basics of our Middle East foreign policy. It's not something that is dramatically different from it. So going back to the basics, in my estimation, doesn't really solve a lot. And then when you listen further to what he says about the basics, it makes me even more worried. Because then he's saying that a critical thing for the United States is to retain and nurture the alliances that we have in the region. Technically, they're not alliances, they're more strategic partnership, but nevertheless, that's the language that he's using. Well, this essentially means, and the reason why that is, he says that, we are the premium, the most desired security partner in the region, that the Chinese cannot compete with us in this context. And that he's absolutely right. Not only cannot the Chinese compete, I don't think they want to compete in that area. But what it means, though, is that in order to sustain this alliance, which in that analysis is needed in order to be able to make sure that the United States has as many assets as possible in this competition with the Chinese, we just have to work really hard to retain the strategic partnerships we have, however badly those strategic partners behave. So at the center of what we're doing in the Middle East is that we just have to keep those alliances. We have to keep the Saudis, we have to keep the Emiratis, we have to keep all of these different states because we need them on our side as we compete with China. That means that we've gone dramatically away from what the earlier language was, in which, an analysis would have started off with what our national interest actually is. And from there on, figure out, should we be this militarily involved in the region? Do we need it, et cetera, et cetera. Instead, now the premium seems to be put on making sure that we keep these alliances. And as a result, we have to give those strategic partners more. We need to keep them happy. If the Saudis want to bomb Yemen and we think that's really bad, well, we just have to go along with what the Saudis want, because we got to keep them happy so that they remain on our side in this competition with China, particularly now when it's increasingly clear the Saudis and the Emiratis are trading more with the Chinese, they're buying more weapons from the Chinese, etc. Makes it all the more important that we pull them closer to us by pulling ourselves closer to their policy positions. That's the evolution that I think I've seen in the last year. I think it explains why we're suddenly in a position in which, when you listen to the White House on Yemen, I mean, the language is almost indistinguishable from the language that the Saudi government is using. We're talking about the Houthis as if they're a direct threat to the United States, which they're not. And in fact, if the Houthis in the attacks against Abu Dhabi in the last week or so, which comes directly after the Emiratis have engaged in a major offensive in Yemen, if one of those attacks actually was targeting an American base close to Abu Dhabi, then it's actually this sick reasoning, frankly, this misguided reasoning going full circle, because the Houthis were not a direct threat to the United States. In fact, the United States collaborated with the Houthis against Al-Qaeda prior to the war. But now, after 7 years of the Saudis bombing Yemen and us providing the bombs for them to do so, if the Houthis now are attacking the United States, then we have gone from a situation in which they were not a threat, but now they're actually targeting the United States. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy of a very, very unwise policy. I don't know if the administration can pull itself out of this, because it seems to me that this idea of retaining the alliances, which means in essence that we're constantly going to be deferring to them, is going to become the guiding star of the policy of the United States in the region. And we've seen what that led to before. So I'm quite pessimistic now compared to a year ago, in which I was actually quite hopeful and optimistic, particularly after the president announced the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I thought this was going to be the beginning of a broader shift in the region, and so far that's not been the case.
Thank you for that. God, you just gave us so much information, and I think that there are elements of the Biden administration that should be capable of fulfilling the promises from the campaign trail. General Lloyd Austin, now Secretary of Defense, I believe was furious when we supported Saudi Arabia against the Houthis. I believe he was involved in that collaboration, as you said. But I'm wondering how much influence weapons contractors have, as well as foreign lobbies. We're incredibly concerned, like you mentioned, with great power competition returning to the fore and dividing the world into camps, and the danger that goes along with that. But we're also very concerned about the influence of these extremely powerful corporations that make up the military-industrial complex, and what effect that may have over the policies of the Biden administration.
I think that concern is obviously very justified. And it seems like whatever yet happens, they manage to make some additional profits. I would caution one thing, though. I think it's one thing to say that they're very powerful and that they need to be countered. I think one should be careful not to go to the point of and that's not what you said, Brian, but I just want to clarify, to think that essentially they're invincible, because they're not. In fact, they were the biggest losers in the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So if they're invincible, there would never have been an Afghan withdrawal, and we would never have been in a situation in which, because I mean, they were the ones who were really making so much money off of all of that. And there, I have to say something. I'm obviously very pleased that the president pulled out, but to be completely honest, would he have done so had Trump not forced his hand by signing that agreement, in which it was very clear, if you violate the agreement, there's going to be an uptick in violence and war. So the status quo essentially was no longer an option. I would tend to think that most likely, had Trump not done that, Biden would have also not chosen to pick a fight on this issue and would have just gone along, even though probably deep in his heart, he would not be happy about it. He would probably have argued, or it would have been argued to him, that with all of the domestic crisis that the United States is facing right now, you don't need this crisis. Just let it be on autopilot, as almost every other president up until this point has done.
Thanks. And certainly we are not defeatist when it comes to taking on the military-industrial complex here in Massachusetts Peace Action. In fact, we've joined a new network of groups across the country that are taking on their local weapons manufacturers. And
Excellent.
showing a lot of
Excellent.
promise, in fact, and we'll send everyone a link about how you can get involved in that. But I'd like to bring in my colleague Chloe Steele, who has a very important question about a subject that you are quite expert in. So let me bring Chloe on screen.
Yes, hi. I was wondering how everything you've talked about, how that coincides with the GCPOA deal. How do one another affect each other? And how do does the success of one depend, does the success of the GCPOA depend upon the failure or success of the Baghdad Dialogue, or vice versa? And how do they affect each other, basically?
Thank you, Chloe. I think that's an excellent question. If you have a JCPOA, I think it would give a significant boost to the Baghdad Dialogue, because the JCPOA in and of itself makes it easier for the United States to start disentangling itself militarily from the region. The threat, or the perceived threat, or the threat perception of Iran was a key reason for the US to keep a lot of troops in the region. If you have a JCPOA and you see that significant reduction of tension, that would also free up the United States not to have to be there. This is part of the reason why the Emiratis, the Saudis, and the Israelis very much oppose the JCPOA, because they recognize that this actually could have been the ticket out for the United States from the Middle East. If you don't have, if you just go along with the, if you have no JCPOA, and you have a collapse of the Baghdad Dialogue, and Abrams Accord, and it becomes the only game in town, even with a JCPOA, I think that would be a dangerous situation, because it essentially means, okay, so we have a JCPOA, we're not going to have an Iranian nuclear program, but we're going to continue to have confrontation with Iran on a whole set of other issues, because confrontation with Iran is a necessity for the Abrams Accord to be able to survive and continue. You need to have that enmity. Again, I want to bring your attention to Jared Kushner's document. It explicitly says that any improvement in relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia is a threat to the Abrams Accord. That's why I think it's so dangerous to actually call this a peace accord, because it says in order for the Abrams Accord to survive, there needs to be continued tensions and enmity between these other states. This is, again, fundamentally different from the Baghdad Dialogue, which in fact, I think if it is given time and is successful, actually could eventually bring Israel into the Baghdad Dialogue, whereas there's no such possibility for the Abrams Accord, because it is premised on a threat perception of Iran. You need that enmity for these other states to be able to continue to have their accords. So even with a JCPOA, I think an Abrams Accord can actually end up playing the role of a spoiler. You take the JCPOA out of it, and you only have the Abrams Accord, and then we're pretty much back to where we were before, in which we will be on a path towards confrontation, unfortunately.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And this leads me to my next question is, if the GCPOA was a success, would the United States recognize this and kind of pull out of the Abrams Accord and let the Baghdad Dialogue kind of flourish, or would they try to do both?
So I don't foresee any scenario in which the Biden administration would pull out. I think earlier on in the administration, they were a little bit cool to the Abrams Accord, and I don't know if that was because they wanted to create a bit of a distance between themselves and Trump. They were talking about calling it something else, which then makes it a little bit suspicious as to whether it is trying to detach it from Trump. I don't think there's a need to pull out necessarily. I think what is needed is to make sure that it doesn't end up becoming something that defines the rest of the Middle East, because the way it would define it is that there needs to be continued conflict between these blocs in order for their accord to survive. I do also hope, however, that what the United States would eventually do on this issue is either, I mean, I think it's highly problematic for the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict if the United States is essentially saying, we're giving the Israelis everything they want for before anything happens. Golan, embassy, recognition amongst all of these other states, and then claim that miraculously that would then lead to a Netanyahu or a Bennett government to give up the West Bank or give up Palestinian territory that has been occupied. I mean, that's just simply nonsensical. It's frankly insulting that such an argument is being made. So the question is not whether to pull out of the Abrams Accord. The question, in my view, is will the United States either do something to put pressure on all sides to get serious about talks, or at a minimum, get out of the way. Get out of the way and allow other countries that perhaps can play a more fair role in this, help mediate and resolve this conflict. Because right now, what the United States is doing is simply just putting its weight squarely on one side of the equation. And that is what it has enabled the occupation to continue. There's no price for it. Whenever there has been some meager attempts to push back against it, the US quickly backs off. That's also what happened during the Obama administration, in which early on he wanted to push back against these illegal settlements, and he got a tremendous amount of pushback from the Netanyahu, and then essentially the Obama administration, which started off giving a talk and saying within a year we're going to have a Palestinian state at the UN. This is what Obama said. A year later, the United States vetoed the General Assembly resolution seeking to recognize a Palestinian state. So at a minimum, just get out of the way and let others do something, because what is happening right now is us allowing and enabling the conflict and the occupation to continue.
Wow, yeah, we're trying to bring a lot of these issues to light here. And it's great to get your perspective on it. So now I'll take it to the chat and read out some questions. So Jennifer Lowenstein asked, will the Baghdad Dialogue deal with the war in Yemen?
The Baghdad Dialogue has dealt with the war in Yemen. The main conversation between the Iranians and the Saudis has been on Yemen. The Saudis have wanted to see the Iranians deliver things by putting pressure on the Houthis. I think to a certain extent, the Saudis may have been victims of their own rhetoric, because I think they have played up the influence that the Iranians have over the Houthis, and now it's become quite clear. The Iranians can put pressure on them, but they cannot really deliver them. The Houthis are their own organization. They have conveniently taken Iranian support, but Iran does not have any control over them. And that's been a bit of a challenge there. At least one of the rounds of dialogue in Baghdad, there was also a representative of the Houthis in the conversation. And this is ultimately what we need. Unfortunately, it hasn't led to the results that we wanted, but this is what we need. We need them to talk to each other. If the UN cannot play that role, if the United States cannot play that role, and it's just amazing that a country like Iraq, with all of its challenges, have decided to take on this role. They should really be commended for it.
Yeah, thank you. And now I'll let Alan Luxembourg, who is raising his hand, ask his question.
Thank you. I wanted to ask if you would consider the possibility that you're giving too much credit to the Trump administration for propelling the Abraham Accords, since in effect there was already a tacit alliance between the UAE and Saudi Arabia well before Trump took office, largely in reaction to those countries' concerns that Obama was pushing a deal with Iran, because they were concerned they would be left out and left by themselves. So they pushed for, in effect, a silent alliance with Israel by virtue of the fact they shared a common enemy. And I'm not sure that dynamics that propelled that initial tacit alliance have changed in any way, in the sense that Iran does pose a threat to all of those countries, and therefore it's natural that they should seek an alliance to work together against that threat.
Thank you, Alan. I'm not so sure. I think it's a great question, and I want to unpack some elements of it. But I want to start off, I don't think the premise is entirely correct. The idea that Iran is this common threat that is so overwhelming that it made these countries that otherwise have such differences to come together, I'm not so sure that that is the case. For instance, if that was the case, we would have seen a rather different behavior by the Emiratis. The Emiratis, if you take a look at who are they fighting in the Middle East, they're fighting the Turks and the Muslim Brotherhood, much more so than they're fighting the Iranians. That's not to say that they don't perceive a threat from Iran. I think that's absolutely true. I think the real threat that all three of them perceive is a bit different. It's not Iran per se, although Iran has a key element to it. The real threat that I think they perceive is that if the United States actually manages to strike a deal with Iran, this is 2015, and reduces its tensions with Iran, it would enable the United States to leave the region. That's the threat. The threat of the United States reducing its military presence in the region, because the US's military presence in the region is a massive finger on the balance, on the scale, that is shifting the balance of power in the region dramatically in their favor in a manner that these countries, certainly not the UAE and Saudi Arabia, can do on its own. So having the US there is providing them with a rather beneficial balance with maneuverability, margins that they cannot create on their own. So keeping the US locked into the region is the key commonality that these three states have, which is what brought them much closer together. Iran is an element of this, without a doubt. But if it was just Iran, then the fascinating question is this. Why isn't Iran, without a nuclear weapon and without a nuclear program that has the capacity to become a nuclear weapons program, pose a greater threat to these states than an Iran that actually had an unchecked nuclear program? Because it's during the period in which they're actually moving with the JCPOA that you see this consolidation of this alliance. So why is it, if it's truly the threat component of it, why is it that it's during that period that these three countries came together in the manner that they did? I don't think the threat argument explains that. It's the threat of the US leaving that much better explains that. But to your other question, or your first component of the question, yes, you're absolutely right. Elements of this collaboration existed before, particularly between the UAE and the Israelis when it comes to intelligence sharing. It is a rather important step, however, to take that publicly, given the history of the region. Iran, for instance, was an ally of Israel during the 1970s, but the Shah did everything he could to never recognize Israel de jure, never give Israel an actual embassy or any elements of that type of a recognition, because that was supposed to be saved until after the Israeli-Palestinian issue had been resolved. Otherwise, it would create unwarranted headaches for the Iranians. So getting to the recognition point is not a minor thing in all of this. And that would not have happened had it not been for what the Trump administration did, because they were the only ones that were willing to push for that agenda. Not even the Bush administration. In fact, the Bush administration broke with previous American policy and declared there has to be a Palestinian state. If you recall, back in the 1990s, Hillary Clinton got into trouble for having said that there should be a Palestinian state. The taboo of saying that there should be a Palestinian state broke during the Bush administration. So they were not pushing for these type of things back then. So in that sense, I do believe that it is a big thing, and it's not me necessarily giving them positive or negative credit. I'm saying that there was no other element in the US government, in a US administration, that was willing to push in this direction in the manner that the Trump administration did. And I think it was quite telling when there was an interview with Kushner early on, and arguing, asking, why do you think, your approach is going to succeed? And which essentially the effort was to buy off the Palestinians. And he said, we may fail, but if we fail, we're going to fail trying something very, very different from what had been done before. And in that sense, I think they were right. They tried something that previous US administrations had not even pushed for.
Yes, I just wanted to note quickly that we will be sharing the article that this entire program was based on. You've referenced this strategic document that came out of the Trump administration, and you very helpfully linked to it in that piece. So I just want to let people know that we're going to be sending that to everyone in a follow-up email, as well as other ways that you can find Trita's work. But I just wanted to notice we were talking about the JCPOA and how a return to the Iran nuclear deal would only make this dialogue more fruitful, more possible. And I wanted to let everyone know on the call that we agree, and we agree so much that tomorrow we have partnered with our friends at Code Pink, and we are going to be advocating on behalf of the JCPOA a return to the Iran nuclear deal, a return to talks, and the removal of sanctions. And I just want to put in the chat, and I'll also be sending it out to you. We're going to be talking with Asal Rad, who's at the National Iranian American Council, where Trita was a former president and a co-founder of that great organization as well. But so I encourage everyone to sign up and to take part in that advocacy as well. We are still very big supporters of the JCPOA. But right now I want to bring in my colleague Prasannan, who has a follow-up question.
Rita, thank you so much for your excellent presentation and answers to questions and so on. But I just want to follow up on your answer to the previous question and ask to what extent the US presence is needed by countries like Saudi Arabia and UAE for their own internal political situation. I mean, having the US presence there and support for these states seems awfully critical as well. And it seems to be, I would think, is part of the equation here.
I think you're absolutely correct in that. It is definitely part of the equation. The extent to which the United States commits itself to the security of these states gives these regimes greater confidence that the United States is then also committed to their survival as regimes. Ultimately, this is what these regimes mostly care about at the end of the day, because these are not democracies, these are family dynasties. And if you're putting yourself in the shoes of Qatar, for instance, who there was almost a coup against them during the Trump administration, they want to have those type of assurances from the United States. I think there's no doubt about that. And in that context, I do have to say also that there's another element that I haven't mentioned here that is important to understand of what it is that the Israelis didn't give as a concession, but actually agreed to sell. And there's a very good New York Times article about this that came out over the weekend, I believe, that show that the sales of NSO and Pegasus, this extremely intrusive spy software that is capable of hacking any cell phone, any Android or iPhone, and then has been used not only by police departments, etc., to catch criminals, but increasingly used by governments, authoritarian governments, to clamp down on journalists, dissidents, etc. These were sold, and these were sold to the UAE as part of the Abraham Accord. It was a big component. So it goes back to what you're saying. These are things that the UAE is using in order to secure its own government's reign and making sure that it is not threatened by its own population or other movements. And what the US can provide is by having military forces there, etc. They make that commitment. What the Israelis have been able to provide is this spyware that now even the US government has turned against, and there's a conflict between the US government and Israel on this issue.
Yeah, I think that's a really important aspect to bring up. Another thing that you mentioned in your piece, as you just laid out, the Abraham Accords have depended largely upon the United States giving military technology to some of these countries. The F-35 to the UAE, for example, may be the most expensive weapons system in the history of the United States military. But one thing that you mentioned in your piece that that led up to the Baghdad Dialogue was the attack, the drone attack in 2019 that did serious damage for a time to Saudi Arabia's oil production. What is the effect of this seeming revolution in military affairs where much less expensive technology can pose a serious threat to something as important as Saudi Arabia's oil production?
Yeah. So I'm not a military analyst, so I will give you an answer that probably is not as sophisticated as you deserve. But I think you're putting your finger on something that is quite, frankly, somewhat predictable. That at the end of the day, this type of overwhelming technological superiority is very difficult to be able to sustain. If you take a look at what happened in the Gaza War this past summer compared to 2014, you see a very different picture because of the way that Hamas had been able to pick up some of this technology. Whereas it was just Katyusha rockets before, which the Iron Dome could take down quite effectively. Now you had a scenario in which Hamas was using drones and other things to be able to attack, and as a result was more effective, and the Israelis were actually less effective than they were before. That's not to say that the Israelis are still not completely militarily superior to Hamas. There's no doubt about that. But the gap is closing, and the gap is also closing between, at least in certain areas, between the Iranians and those who are being armed by the United States. Different ways can be found. And I think that is what we're seeing. And that's why I think relying entirely just on technology and thinking that you can remain militarily, technologically superior indefinitely, and that is a ticket towards peace, that is ultimately a false assumption. Because if you're relying on that type of military superiority, you're not going to be able to keep it up. And when you're going towards a situation in which you're losing it, instead of being able to be in a position to vie for peace, you're probably going to get a dose of your own medicine, unfortunately. I mean, that seems to have been the pattern. And that's why I think, again, pushing back against agreements, accords, or other things that are relying on these type of military disparities as the formula for peace is very important, because they rarely provide peace and more oftentimes tend to make things worse.
I think that is very well said and a very sophisticated answer. I'm going to throw it back to Chloe for some more audience questions.
Okay, so moving on to the next question in the chat is from Paul Shannon. Paul asks, what are the implications of the election of al-Sadr in Iraq?
On this issue, well, one of the things that has happened on this issue is that since Sadr came into power, we've not seen a continuation of the Baghdad Dialogue, at least not at the speed and the format as it was before. Kadhimi played a critical role in it, but it had the support of the entire Iraqi system. I have little doubt that Sadr probably would be quite positively disposed to it, but it seems like because of certain, some instabilities and question marks inside of the Iraqi system itself, for now, that is not proceeding in the manner that it would before. But there's also some information that some of that dialogue is now more or less self-sufficient in the sense that it can take place even without direct Iraqi mediation or facilitation. And if that is the case, that certainly is a good thing.
Yeah, thank you. And then the next question from Seti Razani asks, will US continue to contain Iran after this change? And I'm not exactly sure which change you're referring to, but if you want to jump in, Seti, and talk a little bit about that, you're welcome to.
I think they were referring to the Baghdad Dialogues.
Mm.
Yeah, specific.
So let me perhaps twist the question a little bit and say, okay, let's assume that we actually end up with the JCPOA. Is that going to lead to a situation in which the United States is going to continue to contain and isolate Iran? Well, the JCPOA was actually supposed to be the end of that isolation. During the last 30 plus years, the United States was making sure that Iran was excluded from as many political bodies as possible, from as many economic agreements as possible. That would actually be in violation of the JCPOA if that continued, because the JCPOA opened up a significant corridor for legitimate trade. And if that would have been continued to be put, if in spite of that, there would have been more sanctions or other efforts to keep Iran out, that actually would be a violation of the JCPOA and wouldn't be able to stand. What we're seeing now, though, what worries me is that even though we may end up getting a JCPOA, which I think obviously would be a very good thing, the manner in which trust and confidence between the two sides have eroded, not just during the Trump years, but frankly, during the last couple of the last 12 months of the Biden administration, because of the strategy that Biden chose, instead of just going straight back into the deal, negotiating in return, which now almost 10 months later is still not produced a result. I fear that we will end up with a JCPOA that is more shrouded in mistrust than was the case in 2015. And as a result, we may still end up in a situation in which, again, we have a JCPOA, but nothing else on US-Iran relations changes. And we're going to have continued confrontation and tensions and everywhere else. We're just going to, and expecting that that would be okay and that the JCPOA would be able to survive that. So my worry is that whereas before there was a decent chance that the JCPOA could be the beginning of diplomacy and that it could lead to dialogue on a whole set of other issues, it seems now more likely that it will be JCPOA will be the end, the finite point of diplomacy, and there's not going to be much more beyond that.
Another question related to the JCPOA, Paul Barker asks if the JCPOA can be restored in a somewhat timely manner, to what extent could Iranian oil and gas sales to Europe decrease the threat of a cutoff of Russia oil and gas sales to Europe?
Great question. I will not claim to have any expertise when it comes to these things. Let me just say this. With some of the things that are being sorted out right now in the negotiations is exactly directly related to this point, which is the speed and the timing of certain things. As I understand that we will likely be able to see Iranian sales of oil, etc., happening faster after a deal has been signed than was the case in 2015. Whether that will be able to replace Russian gas for Europe requires, I don't believe that pipelines and the infrastructure for that is set to make it a direct sale. But there is sale going from Iran to Turkey right now. Perhaps that volume could increase and the Turks would be able to sell it onwards to Europe. So it seems to at least open up the possibility for that. But the speed in which that would be able to take place, I'm not an expert on.
I'm going to bring in Prasannan again, who has another question for you, Trita, if that's all right.
Sure.
Trita, this question is a little bit out of left field, as they say, but since we have you here, I think it would be great to get your thoughts on something, which is, are there concerns within some of the oil states in the Middle East about the future of the oil market with action on climate change? I mean, is there active discussion going on in places like Iran and Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and so on how to react to what will hopefully be coming down the pipe?
Sorry, I'm not sure I quite understood the question.
I'm just asking if within sort of ruling circles and policy makers and so on in places like Saudi Arabia, are there discussions taking place on how to respond if the oil market or the demand for oil really goes down because of action on climate? I mean, are there scenarios being discussed and debated and so forth for the future of the region?
Again, great question, but I will not claim any expertise on it, except to say, I sure hope so. I think it would be quite sad if there aren't any conversations taking place on that front, and also more specifically, if you have Iranian oil coming back on the market, we're talking about up to 4 million barrels of oil coming back onto the market right away. What would that do on the broader price of oil globally? And as I'm sure you've seen, prices are currently going up quite fast. I mean, we see the gas prices in the United States. And that's not necessarily something that some of the other GCC states would welcome. Certainly, American oil companies would not welcome that. So, that is definitely, I'm sure, a consideration that is taken into account. But ultimately, I suspect it is not decisive on this issue, because at the end of the day, I don't find it likely that they will forsake the JCPOA in order to keep gas prices high, because without the JCPOA, gas prices are going to go up much, much more because of the tensions that will be springing out of that situation.
And thank you for that. And with that, we're going to let Trita go on to his important work. Thank you for spending so much time with us, and we always appreciate your analysis.
Thank you so much. It's great being with you all. I'm happy to do it again. And thank you again for everything you guys did.
Before you leave, though, where's the best place for people to find your work?
Sorry, to find.
Where's the best place for people to find and support your work, Trita?
Oh, thank you. Two places. Go to the organizational website, which is quincy.org. And you can also go to my personal website, tritaparsi.org, or .com, sorry, .com.
Okay, thanks for that.
All right, thank you so much.
Appreciate all your time.
My
and
pleasure.
Don't worry about finding those links right now, everyone. We're going to be sending out a follow-up email with all of this information. Trita is just a wealth and threw so much at us tonight, but we will be sending a follow-up email with all of the different links that were mentioned, and also ways to get involved, and also information about our program tomorrow night, where we are going to be advocating live for a return to the JCPOA, which, as Trita just told us, would make a world of difference to the diplomatic situation in the Middle East. But we just always appreciate Trita's analysis, and even more, the Quincy Institute, which he co-founded, is a resource for activists. It has made our work so much easier to have this expertise to draw on. So, we thank Trita and his colleagues, Marcus Stanley, Anel, Sheline, Andrew Basevich. Their commitment to peace and responsible statecraft, which is right there in the name of the Quincy Institute, is just unparalleled, I will say. But we really appreciate everything that Trita had to say, and I think the point that he was driving at is that there are two different options for the United States withdrawing from the Middle East. One that involves still the presence of American weapons to control the region, and one that relies on open dialogue between nations, so the region can stand on its own 2 feet and will no longer be, under the control of the United States, which is a foreign power that no longer has credibility in the region. So I want to thank everyone. I want to thank Chloe and Prasanan for your help tonight, as well as Trita Parsi for spending so much time with us. And just before I leave you, I would just recommend that if you'd like to support Massachusetts Peace Action, please check us out at masspeaceaction.org, where you can become a member. We are a membership organization that depends on the donated time of our volunteers and activists, some of whom planned this very webinar that you're watching right now. So if you'd like to do that yourself, I encourage you to check us out at masspeaceaction.org. And become a member. You can be a part of this organization, and you can plan the next program with Trita or any number of experts on all of the different subjects that we cover. So thank you for spending your time with us, and we encourage you to get more involved. And I hope to see you tomorrow night with our program with Code Pink and Asal Rod, and Senator Ed Markey. But thanks again to Chloe and Prasanan, and thank you all for joining us, and have a great evening.